Hello there, and welcome to our second Spectrum debate, whether you're watching on YouTube, Google Plus, or elsewhere. Tonight we're going to focus our debate on one theme, which is, has the coalition been a force for good? In a few moments, I'm going to ask each of our guests, who you can see down here, to identify what is, in their opinion, the best and worst thing about the coalition government. And we're going to focus our debate tonight on those topics. But we want to hear your views, and we want you to send in questions or points to challenge each of our guests. You can do so using the hashtag SpectrumDebate, singular, just to clarify that from last week when I got it wrong. Or if you're watching on Google Plus, you should be able to use the Q&A feature and be able to interact on there as well. Now, I'll do my best to put your questions to our guests and to let all of our viewers know what it is that you are thinking. We do still have a couple of last-minute spots available because of technical difficulties with one of our guests. So if you are an economic Orange Book Lib Dem or a supporter of any opposition party or a supporter of none, get in touch with us very quickly. I'll send you the link and you can join us down here to make our panel a little bit more politically diverse. So if you would like to appear below, tweet us ASAP at Spectrum Debates. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests to you and find out what they think are the best and worst features of the coalition. Tonight we start with three guests who do support the coalition, but they have very different views on it. Our first guest tonight is Mr. Alex Ward. Alex is a politics student from Hampshire and a student radio show host who's a supporter of the Conservatives, in particular of the modernising wing of the party, and he can be found on Twitter at Mr. Alex Ward. Our next guest is Matthew Hulbert. He's a Liberal Democrat councillor from Leicestershire and has twice been shortlisted for Lib Dem Councillor of the Year. Amongst other things, he champions fair trade and LGBT rights. You can tweet him at HulbertMatthew, 1T. Our next guest is Elliot Smith. He's a student from London and a Bexley youth councillor, and he's passionate about getting more young people involved in politics. He has a more traditional approach to the Conservative Party, which he supports, and you can tweet him at Elliot Smith, 1L, 1T. Our next contributor is Miss Lily Jane Summers, a Labour supporter and blogger who hails from the West Midlands. Lily is a liberal socialist and one of our original Spectrum debaters, and she is also very active on Twitter, where you can interact with her at Miss Lily Summers 1L. And I'm sorry about this, I'm going to flick back to me. I'm Gareth, I'm your host tonight, and whilst I am a Conservative councillor, I'll do my best to play devil's advocate and to challenge all of our guests for tonight. Our standard disclaimer here is that whilst each of our guests may support a party, none of them speaks for or on behalf of that party. If you'd like to appear here next week or in future, DM at Spectrum Debates and reserve your place. And we're going to begin by asking our first guest, who was drawn at random before the show, to give us their views. In fact, I'm going to do what I should have done a moment ago, and I'm going to ask each of our guests to tell us their favourite and least favourite thing about the coalition, and then we're going to go to our first guest, who's going to go into some of his, and that first one will be Elliot. Alex, your best and worst things about the coalition?
I would have to argue... Is it me? My internet's playing up absolutely terribly, but that's what you get with having Virgin Media.
Oh, careful, careful. Off you go.
I would argue that the best thing about the coalition government is the economic successes that it has achieved. We have record employment, continuous growth over the last year or so. It's not been perfect, even though when people were asking for a plan B, we've stuck to the course of reducing the deficit and creating jobs in the private sector.
And what would be your least favourite feature about the coalition?
It would be bad of me to just say the Liberal Democrats. The way the coalition agreement has not necessarily been respected. There are things on both sides of the agreement that were made that have been withdrawn or through party squabbles have not gone through Parliament. Let's say House of Lords reform and equalising of the constituencies in the UK for the Commons.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to you, Councillor Hulbert. Your best and worst features of the coalition, please.
Hi there, good evening. Well, my best is, and you might expect this from me as a gay man, but it's equal marriage, same-sex marriage. I think fantastic. If the coalition did nothing else, it's been worth having for that massive step forward in terms of equality, which I think has been fantastic. In terms of my worst, I think not doing enough to help the very poorest. I think the very poorest have been left to rot by this government, and in some respects it's behaved shamefully towards the poorest. There's been a concerted campaign against them.
Thank you very much. Elliot, your best and worst?
I think I'm going to have to join Alex on this one, and the whole economic activities that have been going on in this government have been, I'm not going to say brilliant, but have definitely helped the economy overall. So I'm going to say the economic benefits that we've had in this government are going to be my best things.
And the worst?
The worst is going to be how the education system has been dealt with, the scrapping of EMA, the raising of tuition fees, and just the overall blunder in some areas.
Thank you very much. And Lily, the best?
I think the best thing the coalition have done was relatively early, because one of the first things they did was scrapping ID cards, which a new Labour government was introduced, or they're about to introduce. So I think one of the best things the coalition did in particular was scrapping ID cards, because I think it was very authoritarian, wasn't very good for civil liberties. So I think for the best thing would definitely be ID cards. I would mention equal marriage as well. I do think that was a good decision, despite the fact that it does include discriminatory provisions towards trans people. For instance, the trans spouse veto. So same-sex marriage is also good, despite that.
And the worst feature of the coalition?
I think the worst. I mean, both Alex and Elliot have mentioned the economic benefits, but I would completely disagree. I think in terms of the economy, it's been one of the worst. I mean, you mentioned reducing the deficit, Alex, but you said you would eliminate the deficit by 2015. So you completely failed in the deficit. You mentioned continuous growth, but for the first 3 years, it completely stagnated. We were very, very close to having a double-dip recession by 0.1% growth. So failed on the deficit, you failed on growth. Record number of jobs is good, but the problem is once you have a bigger population all the time, it's not a big claim as it really is.
Okay.
And in terms of the economy, let me just finish. In terms of the economy in general, inequality has gotten risen, and I agree completely with Matthew that in terms of the coalition hasn't helped the poorest enough in terms of austerity. The poorest have dealt the most pain in terms of austerity, in terms of living standards. So in terms of the economy, I think they've made a complete mess of it.
Okay, so as you can see, there are going to be some quite big debates tonight on the economy, equal marriage. What else did we have here? Whether or not the government's been any good at helping the very poorest in our society, scrapping of ID cards, EMA, tuition fees, and the coalition agreement in and of itself. So if you want to tweet us your views or use Q&A on Google+, please do. We're going to go to Elliot now, who's going to start off the discussion on the economy. Elliot, what is it that makes you say that this government's done any good on the economy after what Lily's just told us?
Well, first of all, I've got to mention the rise in jobs, because the whole unemployment issue which we were left with after the last government was, what's the word for it? It wasn't something we could really deal with straight off, but near the end of the government we have got better unemployment rates and just job rates overall, which I think is something that's really good just for normal hard-working people who want to do more for themselves. And the increases in wages people are getting has also been very good. But slightly in that point, there have been some drops in wages, and I'm going to go slightly off conservative here and say that the whole implementation of living wage is something which I do agree with, and that lack of implementation has been the downside, I feel, of the economic side.
Elliot, isn't the living wage, because you're from London, isn't the living wage particularly an issue in London, perhaps not so much the rest of the country, particularly those of us in the Midlands and the North, where living costs are so much lower?
It's definitely an issue in London. I live personally on the suburbs of London, so it's not as bad, but certainly in central London, if you're a person on minimum wage living in central London, it's extremely hard to get by. I believe it's £8.80 or something, living wage which they recommend Londoners get, and that just reflects the housing prices and just general inflation of prices in the capital.
Okay, thank you. Who'd like to go next? Let's go to you, Matthew.
Okay, well, I mean, I think there has been some economic successes. I think it's been fantastic that we've taken so many of the moderately paid workers out of income tax, and despite the fact that the Tories try and claim that as their idea, there's been polls to show that people do recognise that that was a Liberal Democrat idea that's been taken from the front page of our manifesto and delivered into government. But I do go back to the fact that saying that whilst that has been good, it's not helped the very poorest. And I read a devastating report in The Guardian just this past week, which talked about people who felt that they had to go out and steal because they literally did not have, they managed to have a caution against them in terms of their benefits. They've been left with nothing at all. They have children. They ended up having to go out and steal. Now, no one would condone them stealing, but this is the desperate situation that the very poorest have found themselves in, and the government have effectively shrugged their shoulders.
That's a good point.
Okay, just on that particular point, what is it you think the government should be doing, or a government should do, about the very poorest? Because is this government's whole raison d'etre not trying to get those who can work into work, and by doing so making work pay?
Well, I mean, just to answer that very briefly, I think there's two sides to this government. I'd like to think, as Tim Farron, the then party president, has said, he and I both believe in an active liberalism, and that means an enabling state. Not an overly interfering state, but an enabling state that yes, does have a role in creating jobs and economic success, that does see some redistribution of wealth. Yes, I am going to say it. I think redistribution of wealth is important. But then there's the Tories who don't believe really in government at all. And they certainly don't believe that it should have much of a role. They kind of believe if you've not been successful, well, poor you. You know, you'll just have to try and manage. And so I think there's a sharp divide between the two coalition parties.
Alex, I know you're having a few technical difficulties. Are you able to say anything on that? Did you hear it? No, Alex seems to be having a few problems right now.
There are more slurs at the moment in this connection than me when I'm drunk, so I really cannot hear what people are saying right now.
Okay, well perhaps if you if you disconnect and reconnect, and let's see if that helps. Lily, let's come to you. What do you have to say on this so far?
Well, I know Matthew just mentioned the personal allowance. I think the personal allowance was a very good thing, specifically as it's a tax cut for the most poorest. But there's no point increasing the personal allowance, but then you increase VAT, then you cut tax credits, then you get rid of EMA, then you introduce tuition fees. So in a way, it's just giving with one hand but taking with another. So I do say the personal allowance was a good thing, and in particular for the Lib Dem case, the personal allowance was a Lib Dem idea. David Cameron rejected it in the leadership contest in 2010. So if anyone's going to take credit for the personal allowance, I would give it 100% to the Liberal Democrats. So, and another thing I think Elliot mentioned was the rising jobs. I mean, the rising jobs is very good, but there's no point giving people more jobs if you're going to reduce tax credits for in work, and you're going to see their living standards decrease. So there's no point seeing them a pay rise, for example, of 1%, but inflation is 1.5%. So jobs is good. There's still 2 million people unemployed. There's living standards isn't good enough. It's good. It's just not good enough. I mean, I would go back to the deficit, for instance. I mean, the deficit's completely failed. Growth has stagnated for 3 years. And what the coalition said they were going to do in 2010, I mean, most of it they've completely failed on. For example, the AAA credit rating. So it's good, but it's not good enough, in my opinion.
Elliot, any response to any of those issues?
Definitely the AAA credit rating is a massive issue which we've had. And since that's dropped, that has just been a signal that we're not doing enough to combat the deficit and rejuvenate the economy as much. So I completely agree with Lily on that point.
But isn't it the case that Lily's view on that is actually diametrically the opposite? Because her view is it's the efforts to, I'm paraphrasing, correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly many in Labour would say it's the efforts to cut the deficit that have created the issue with the credit rating, whereas many in the government have said actually the failure to get rid of the deficit more quickly is the problem. Lily?
Oh, is it? Yeah, I think, well, not necessarily that, but I think they cut at the wrong time. I mean, I'm not necessarily against the principle of government spending cuts, but you can't make government spending cuts when the growth hasn't been secured, the recovery hasn't been secured. Because there's no point, for instance, cutting government spending by £20 billion and then seeing tax revenues decrease by £30 billion. The deficit is going to go up. So I think it's not necessarily to do with government spending, as per se. It's more to do with tax revenues that's seen the deficit go. It's gone down, but it hasn't gone down enough. So I think, in particular, there's no point reducing government spending, even though technically it has increased because of inflation. That's normal. But because tax revenues hasn't increased enough. So I think you need to look at tax revenues as well, rather than just say, oh, we need to get rid of government spending. You know, it's waste. We can cut government spending by so amount, even though I won't say how much I'm going to cut spending by. So,
okay, just a few points of fact here that people have mentioned is that this government has cut less than Alistair Darling had planned to cut, and in fact spending is increasing. The UK has its AAA credit rating. One agency reduced it, but it has now gone back up, and the others never reduced it. A few other people here. We've got talking about just general positive and negative. We've got, and he's going to get me again here, at Lester Fox and Les Fox. Positive is Gove. The negative, the Lib Dems, failing at life/democratic reform. I'm sure we can come back to that one. Adam Hawkes saying he agrees 100% with the same-sex marriage and economics of the coalition being successes. Sam Baxter, a bit far to say there's been a campaign against the poorest by the Tories. Hardly perfect, but they're not actively against people. Ben Walker is pointing out the use of the occasional hashtag here, normal hard-working people, take a sip. Who wants to come in on this point then?
Shall I come in, Gareth, there? I think, well, I mean, I guess there are some who perhaps feel that there's not been a campaign against the poorest. They've certainly not been helped. Now, whether you call that an active campaign against them, I'd like to think most of the folks in Parliament are good and decent people, and I'm sure they wouldn't say there's been a campaign. But you have to look at the facts, and the Guardian report that I mentioned the other day also referenced the massive increase in food banks. And I was on a discussion programme on the BBC with a Tory MP who is now a minister, and who said, oh, isn't it fantastic that the increase of food banks have gone up? And I thought, is this lady living in kind of on another planet? Does she not realise that it's disgraceful that in one of the richest countries on earth, food bank use in fairly impoverished wards such as the one that I represent has increased? This is disgraceful, but they don't seem to see that. Now, I personally think that that is a concerted campaign against the poorest, but clearly others feel differently.
On a point of fact again here, Matthew, across Europe, in particular in the more wealthy countries in Europe, let's take Germany, for example, food bank use has increased at a very similar rate over the last 8 or 9 years. Is that therefore an issue of this coalition doing things, say, in Germany and France?
Well, I mean, my concern is here in the UK and in wards such as my own, which has significant pockets of deprivation after the loss of traditional industries. In my case here in Barwell, the shoemaking, boot and shoemaking industry died down. There was basically no industry to replace it, and as much as we've tried to bring new jobs into the surrounding area that people in my ward can hopefully go and apply for, there's still significant pockets of deprivation and significant pockets of unemployment. And for the benefit system to be changed to the extent that people having to go to food banks or having to choose between heating and eating, to me is a disgrace. And again, you can say that that is just how it is, or you can describe it as a campaign.
Elliot, anything to say on this?
I'm afraid I've got to agree with him on this one. That my view on benefits is that for people who genuinely need them, for people who genuinely need benefits, they can't survive without them, they're currently between jobs, those kind of things, the benefits should be high enough so they can live on them, so they can actually get along with things. Disability benefits, they should be allowing people so they don't actually have to make these choices between heating or eating, as was just said. But we also have to make sure we get the difference between making sure that people don't have the something for nothing scenario where they're just on benefits for the sake of it. They're not actively looking for jobs, and they're just sitting there on benefits, quite frankly. But I want to reiterate that they should definitely be higher for people who do need them, so they don't have to make these silly choices such as heating or eating. It should be basic rights that they should have both.
Right, what do we all have to say about the fact that there are now more people in employment than ever in our history, that you have something in the region of 180,000 fewer families with no one in work now than in 2010? Are those not clearly good things, and would we not say that where people can work, it's much better for them to work than not?
The problem is, Gareth, though, that a significant number of unemployment is actually hidden behind the figures. That's the problem. Unemployment's got a notorious record of not really telling the truth in terms of the employment figures. So the notion that, oh, unemployment's gone down, but if you look at the specific amount of jobs, for instance, quite a lot of the jobs are just people creating their own business. I mean, in terms of jobs, there doesn't seem to have that reliability or security of jobs, in jobs that are actually really well paid, the jobs that are actually paid through the living wage, jobs that actually see your living standards increase. So I think jobs, the number of jobs that actually has increased during this coalition is good, but considering unemployment was 2.5 million people at the last election, it's not really that difficult to get it down, for instance. It would be utter incompetence if the coalition after 5 years managed to get it above 2.6 million people unemployed, 2.5 million people unemployed, for instance. So,
Matthew.
Hi.
Actually, hang on. Just want to tell people here, so our guests seem to be having some technical issues tonight. We had one who was joining us at the start but couldn't get any sound and is now unable to connect. And as you've seen, Alex has left us and cannot now reconnect. So we're having a few technical issues here. So this is always the peril of doing something like this. A few issues to put to you, people. The first here. I was about to say, Lily Jane Summers has commented on Twitter. Yeah. I'm not going to give you 2 bites of the cherry that way. We've got Sam Baxter pointing out that it's bad that food bank use is up, but Job Centre points people towards them now who are going hungry, and under the previous government they were banned from doing that. People were not offered that help. Which seems a little inhumane. We've also had James Dixon here, who's pointing out that some of the worst problems is that despite investor confidence, the deficit is still big, and there's a terrible public communication of policies, and the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is not a good thing. We'll come on to that. Specifically on the economy, Andy, who's at AndyBlatch64, is saying that the deficit is endogenous to growth control. It is merely a reflection of the state of the economy, to put it simply, despite having, frankly, not really put it simply. But I'm sure you can have another go there, Andy. It's the word endogenous. I can never quite take it seriously. Anyone want to add anything else on the economy before we move on to another topic? Matthew?
Thank you, Gareth. I mean, I just wanted to say that, as Lily Jane has rightly said, one of the major issues is, yes, there's people in work in record numbers and fantastic, but underlying that, there's a lot of underemployment. There's a lot of people who aren't in full-time work, and not because of their own choice, but just because they can only get a certain amount of hours. There's also, of course, 0 hours contracts. Now, I know some people say, I think very much a minority, but some people say that that suits them. But for most people, sure. Sorry, by the way, there's a fireworks thing going on.
There isn't civil war in Leicestershire.
That's right. So, I mean, I think that, you know, it might suit a minority of people, but surely for most folks, if you're, you know, trying to raise a family, to have a situation where you don't know if you've got any work at all, and some weeks you might literally have none, how on earth can you build a situation where you can pay the bills and all the rest of it on a basis like that?
Well, it's true, isn't it, that the overwhelming majority of the jobs created are full-time. They aren't 0 hours contracts, and they're not even part-time work. The overwhelming majority of the new jobs created, something like 3/4 or more, are full-time jobs.
Well, not in places like in my ward, Gareth. I mean.
Yeah, but obviously no one area is going to be representative of the country as a whole, is it? But you can't deny that this Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, that over 3/4 of the jobs created during it have been full-time work, not 0 hours and not part-time.
Well, great. I mean, I welcome that.
Excellent. Any other comments on this one? Lily?
Well, I would just mention in regards to benefits, because Elliot, a little while ago, you mentioned in regards to benefits that people who generally do need benefits should receive it. But the problem in terms of this coalition is they seem to be attacking the most vulnerable in society. They're attacking people who generally need those benefits. And they point out, for example, so-and-so benefit abuse. I mean, it's about 1%, 2%. They're shown daily in the Daily Mail. So I think in regards to benefits, I think the government has been shameful. I mean, some benefits have been necessary because you obviously need to incentivize people into work, but why are they hurting the disabled people primarily? For example, the bedroom tax. I mean, I think that's completely shameful in regards to their benefit policy.
As we know, that's not a tax, but
it's just a saying. It's just a saying. I agree that it's not a tax, but it is a saying.
Gareth, can I just come in on
the way
that?
people know it. Go on, Matthew.
Thank you. I was at the Bosworth constituency Lib Dem annual dinner last night, which was very nice, and we had the Manchester Withington MP, John Leach, come and speak. And he was very frank in saying that he felt that the bedroom tax was the most disgraceful piece of legislation that this government has introduced. I entirely agree. I mean, whilst I absolutely understand that there's a lot of families who need homes with a number of bedrooms to be made available to them, the fact is you can't, and it's affected some people in my ward, you can't have a situation where you're charging people for living in a two-bedroom flat or property when there is no one-bedroom places available in their local area. It is an absolute disgrace and a monstrosity of a piece of legislation and a policy from a dreadful parliament led by Ian Duncan Smith, who to my mind should have been sacked a long time ago.
On the particular issue, Matthew, what do you say to the third of a million families who are living in overcrowded social accommodation? For example, where you've got parents having to share their bedroom with their children because they are stuck in a one or a two-bedroom house with quite a few children, whereas you've got people living on their own in 2, 3 or 4-bedroomed houses for which they have a lifetime tenancy.
I entirely agree, Gareth, but how do you help that by punishing people? That's the word I was looking for earlier on. Punishing people for not being able to move into a one-bedroom property when there aren't any to move into.
Elliot, anything on that score? I've got some challenge here from Gareth Baines in a moment for you, Lily. But Elliot, anything on welfare and taxation before I go to Lily?
Nothing I can immediately think of. Got a bit of mental block here, quite frankly.
Don't you worry. We'll be moving on to our next topic in a moment. Lily, Gareth Baines has suggested that I put this to you, that Ed Balls, who is, of course, as we know, the Shadow Chancellor, has only set out plans to deal with 0.67% of the deficit, which is, as we know, far less than Alistair Darling did when he was actually Chancellor, and that Labour have refused to back any deficit reduction measures during this Parliament. So on what basis can the public really take the Labour Party seriously on the deficit, which, of course, they created?
Well, they didn't really create the deficit today because it was a global recession. So let's not go down the road that the Labour Party destroyed the economy, shall we?
Yeah, they did. But
in terms of future government spending policies, I think all the parties aren't really honest about what they're going to do with government spending. I mean, I remember watching a couple of interviews with, for example, Joe Swinson and important Liberal Democrats on YouTube, and when they asked, okay, you've mentioned the mansion tax, but that's only so and so amount of money towards the deficit. What are you going to do extra? And they couldn't say. And on the Tories, for instance, I mean, they're pledging £7 billion in tax cuts. I mean, how can they make that pledge when you've got a huge deficit? So I think it's not specifically Labour's got a problem with the spending policy, which I agree with Gareth that Labour haven't really specified how exactly they're going to eliminate the deficit. But I'll say no party has done it. No parties are being honest about what government spending cuts they're going to do or how they're going to increase government revenues to eliminate the deficit. Because even in the last Parliament, they weren't really honest at all, even till the end. So it's all parties aren't completely honest what they're going to do.
There's certainly an element of truth about that, although at this point I think there are probably some people screaming at the screen, laugh a curve, talking about the fact that, as we know, often taxes increase.
But that's the only curve. The only curve of the Lafayette Pope is above the Lafayette curve.
Well, again, that's, as we all know, economics is arguable. A couple of final points just in general here, which I thought might be useful before we move on to our next person, and I'll just warn that now using our high-tech paper system. The next person who's going to talk about the good or the bad, and Lily, you take your pick on this one, is going to be you, Lily, okay? But a few points here. Alex Ward, who we know unfortunately can't rejoin us because for some reason he can't get back in, even though his internet's now working, is pointing out, Matthew, in particular, that zero-hour contracts are lifesavers for students in particular, and that we shouldn't forget that. They have a very important place in our economy. I myself actually had a zero-hours contract for about 10 years. And found it very useful whilst I was a student and whilst working. I had one. We've got where are we? A very important point here from Joe Pattinson, who is telling us that the German word for food bank is Tafel or Gassenküche, and I'm sure he'll tell me if I pronounced that incorrectly, which in Germanic Switzerland, he just wanted us to know that. Gareth Baines is pointing out that food bank use on a per capita basis is lower in the UK than in Germany or America, which are wealthier than us. One point here, which we may or may not vote, we may or may not talk about tonight. This is from Gavin at Blue Liberal 1, who is saying, "What do the panelists think about the pedestrianisation of Norwich city centre?"
Very specific.
Well, Gavin always comes up with these very challenging things. Unfortunately, I have to admit I know nothing about this topic. Does anyone else?
I'm going to say I don't agree with complete pedestrianisation of city centres. It's just awful for the traffic flow.
Okay, you
That's
have
a controversial viewpoint, Elliot. That's controversial.
Yeah, this might be more controversial than we go on about. And Mark Parsons at Mark Parsons is pointing out, the bedroom tax, a policy first introduced by Labour.
That's right.
A collection of views there. However, let's move on to our next topic. Lily, best or worst things about the coalition? You picked a couple before. Talked about scrapping ID cards and the worst economic record. You've talked about the economic record. Perhaps you want to talk about one of the other good or bad things that someone raised before.
Am I allowed to go to a completely different topic area? Let's
go
mix
on.
things up a bit.
Seeing as we're having a problem with guests tonight, I'm going to allow you free reign on that one.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's quite interesting is foreign affairs and defence. I think many defence spending cuts have been wrong. I generally believe that the government coalition have got their defence priorities completely wrong. I mean, I would, for instance, rather the government scrap Trident and increase spending on the IRAF. So I think in defence, I think they're wrong to make the sort of cuts they've made to the armed forces. And also on foreign affairs, I think on Libya, for instance, they were completely wrong not to have an aftermath plan in terms of the rebels. So, for example, what we did in Libya, we introduced a no-fly zone, we intervened in Libya, we got rid of Gaddafi, we gave the rebel guns, and then when we got rid of Gaddafi and the infrastructures are down, we completely left them, for instance. So I think on foreign affairs, they shouldn't have intervened in Syria last year, moving on, and I think they were right to intervene against ISIS in terms of airstrikes. So, here's a couple of range of views.
It certainly is. I'll happily come back in a few minutes on the Syria issue because I think one of the worst geopolitical mistakes we've made in a long time was not intervening in Syria last year.
I can't wait to challenge you on that, Gareth.
However, let's go. Elliot or Matthew, would anyone like to talk about the issues to do in particular with defence and international relations that Lily's just talked about? Elliot?
To do with the Trident thing, I've got to say I disagree with scrapping Trident and putting it onto the RAF. I think Trident is, be it slightly outdated, is an important thing that we have to keep us just on the global nuclear scale. If we have a nuclear attack for some reason, we wouldn't be able to retaliate. It keeps us just on the scale, really. If we're going to start getting rid of key defence points such as Trident, we're leaving ourselves vulnerable to an attack. I know an attack's pretty much not a major probability right now, but we don't know. Times might change. We don't want to be left unprepared without a nuclear option.
Thank you. Matthew, I think you've got a slightly different view on Trident in particular.
I have, yes. I mean, I think that Trident should be scrapped. I think it's very much a relic of the Cold War, and the chances of us having to ever use it are very small indeed. I don't suppose it's impossible, but should we retain this thing, just on the very, very 0.1% chance that we may ever need to use it? I think not.
Isn't the whole point about having Trident that we don't ever want to use it, the aim being to prevent others from getting it? Matthew?
I suppose so, but I mean, I think that, I and many other Liberal Democrats think that actually its time is done and it should be scrapped.
Okay, what do you think would be the impact on our standing in the international community, particularly in relation to our permanent seat on the UN Security Council, if we were to scrap Trident? Wouldn't it reduce Britain's influence in the world and give more influence and power to those countries who are developing nuclear weapons that we wouldn't want them to have, such as Pakistan and North Korea?
I think we'd be leading the way, Gareth, just to say very quickly. I think we'd be leading the way and showing that we have an ethical foreign policy.
Okay, Lily, perhaps you'll be able to answer this continuation point for me then. Do you think that if the United Kingdom were to scrap its nuclear deterrent, get rid of Trident and not replace it, that all of a sudden the zealot leadership of Iran and Kim Jong-un and his generals in North Korea would say, the UK has got rid of its nuclear weapons and we'll now be good boys and we'll get rid of ours?
I think you could argue in the complete reverse, really. If we don't scrap Trident, it'll be easier for other countries to get nuclear weapons. So, for instance, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I think it was signed in 1967 or so, the Non-Proliferation Treaty basically set the guidelines for nuclear weapons. And what we said what we agreed to, the countries that had nuclear weapons at that stage is, okay, we'll keep our nuclear weapons, you're not allowed to have them, but we promise we'll reduce our nuclear arsenal. But we haven't done that. We've kept our nuclear arsenal, we haven't reduced it, and if we carry on saying, no, we're going to keep Trident, we're going to get a new set of nuclear weapons, you can't do anything, we'll be breaking our word. We'll be breaking the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which says we're going to gradually reduce and eliminate our nuclear arsenal. So if we're not going to reduce our nuclear arsenal, if we're going to break our part in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, why should Germany keep their part of the bargain and don't have nuclear weapons? I mean, if we're breaking our word, why is Iran not allowed nuclear weapons if we're going to break our word? It doesn't seem very fair to me.
Do you know that we've broken our word? Hasn't our nuclear stockpile reduced in the last 20 or 30 years?
So if we continue Trident, if we get a new, I don't know what once we get more nuclear weapons, or I don't know how to phrase this, but Trident is eventually running out at some point, isn't it? So we're looking to get a new post-Trident nuclear weapons. So if we do that, then surely we won't be reducing our nuclear arsenal. And in my opinion,
go on.
But in my opinion, I mean, nuclear weapons, it's like having a big, giant golden sword, but you can't use it. You're not going to use it in battle, and it costs you an arm and a leg. You're never going to use nuclear weapons. They're not an effective deterrent. They're obsolete. They're weapons of the Cold War, and we could spend a lot, and make our defense policy a lot more efficient if we spend it, for example, on the RAF, on a 21st century Navy, on drones, on new robotics investment in technology. I just generally think Trident isn't a deterrent, and it should be relegated to the Cold War, in my opinion.
Okay, well, we had a comment from John Hudson Mousley again, who, again, one day, if you tell me, I'll make sure I say your name correctly, who started by saying that you, Lily, are being incredibly sound on policy and armed forces, and that for the most part he agrees with you. He then goes on to say, though, look at Ukraine, it is literally the 0.1% chance example of bad things happening. Sam Baxter's reminding us that it might be a mistake to mention Trident, which is the mistake he made last week.
I'm sorry, Sam. I'll stop mentioning Trident now.
Gavin, Blue Liberal 1, who was very interested in Norwich a moment ago, but is now making the point, why do we need them? Can't we just leech them off the Yanks? And we had, where are we? James Dixon, who is saying that what happens tomorrow is at best an educated guess. We need to keep Trident as a security, and Edward Reach certainly agrees with him. Adam Hawkes is pointing out that Trident's a double-edged sword. Are we using it to protect the world or threaten it to do as we bid? An interesting point there. Tell me, Elliot, did you want to add anything on this or anything on the wider issue of defence?
Or foreign affairs?
I got to say, I did like Lily's analogy of the whole gold sword argument, because that's exactly what it is. It's just countries waving their big old gold sword around. Look at me, I'm protected, but it's really expensive. But then on the other hand, if other countries have got that, if one person goes and stabs someone else with their big gold sword, for example, then everyone else is going to stab each other. But if, as long as everyone's standing there with the gold sword, no one's harming everyone else, it's kind of a deterrent of, if I go and stab him with my big gold sword, he'll come and stab me with his big gold sword. So if we drop our big gold sword, keep it on the analogy.
I worry that the analogy is moving into something else.
Yes,
it's
moving into anarchy.
Yeah. Let's move on, shall we, and talk briefly then about Syria. You've all heard at home what Lily and I think briefly. I'm going to ask Matthew and Elliot now to give us their view in terms of Syria and Libya and that kind of international conflict. What do you think? Tweet us, Q&A us, let us know if I can get Q&A working. And I'm going to ask Matthew and Elliot now to give us what their view is of it. Matthew.
Well, I mean, me and you, Gareth, have debated these things on Twitter before and had some quite heated debates on these matters. I mean, I personally felt that it was the right decision that Parliament decided not to take part in that. It was very difficult. These foreign policy matters are never easy, but I think Parliament made the right judgment and were in tune with the British people. I'll be honest, it's partly to do with the legacy of the last Labour government and Tony Blair's administration is that we're war weary. That's just the honest truth as a nation. We're wondering why we keep getting involved in these global conflicts, and I think people are war weary. I think we have seen lots of soldiers' bodies coming back in coffins, and I think, you know, many people are just cautious, and that's how I am. I understand the dreadful situation in Syria, and some days I slightly change my mind and think maybe we should be acting. So, you know, it's difficult to stick with one position, but I just think we need to be cautious on these matters.
I'd like to explore that issue a little bit further, actually, because I think it's an interesting one that Matthew's just raised, and that's the issue about being war-weary. I would suggest that one of the worst things to come out of an early Labour government under Tony Blair was this, that over the previous century or so, when the UK government said, here is an issue that we honestly believe requires us to get involved in some form of armed conflict, whether that be Korea, the Falklands, other issues around that time like Sierra Leone, Kosovo, and so on. British people in general, of course there would be people who disagree, but in general were prepared to accept what their government said because they believed that the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence, whoever they were and whichever party, were not going to be putting UK armed forces in harm's way for anything other than a really good reason. And I would ask what you think about my view that one of the worst things Tony Blair did was actually get rid of that trust because of his behaviour over Iraq. When he asked people to trust him, he produced the dodgy dossier that we're now all aware of, and actually took us to war on a footing that most of us would concede, even those of us who supported it at the time, was not the correct thing to do, was not done in the correct way, and that has weakened the UK tremendously. Anyone? Lily.
Yes. What do you want me to respond to?
Well,
any point?
What do you? By the way, Elliot, we're back in a moment. He's now having technical issues as well. So we're doing.
Everyone's going to die before we finish up. Everyone's going to be all down. We don't want
It's going to be me left ranting at an empty screen.
Don't you do that already, Gareth?
Exactly, it's like my life. On the issue of the worst thing about the Iraq War, not necessarily being the conflict, bad as it was, but being the fact that it destroyed that inherent trust that the people of Britain had with its government to only take us to war for genuine reasons.
Yeah, I do agree with you on that. I think Tony Blair let a lot of people down in regards to the Iraq War. It was a completely disastrous decision, one of the greatest mistakes in our foreign policy since the Suez Crisis in 1956. So I think it was a big mistake. He did seem to base his judgment on trust, saying, look, Saddam Hussein has WMDs, trust me, we've got a dossier that proves it, trust us. But I do think in regards to ISIS, though, that people do think intervention can be necessary, but it has to be a very, very good reason. Maybe that's because of the right-wing propaganda in terms of the media saying, look, ISIS are killing everyone, you've got to take them out. But I do think people can support intervention as long as we know that there is a legal mandate, which didn't occur in Iraq in 2003. And we know what we're going to do, and we know there's going to be an aftermath plan. We know our objectives, which didn't happen in Iraq. We didn't have an aftermath plan. It was a complete mess. So I do think intervention can be necessary, especially when you want to stop genocide. But there needs to be a legal mandate. There needs to be the support of the international community, needs to have the support of the parliament and the people, which does occur against ISIS. And I think as long as we have those preconditions, intervention can work. But it didn't, obviously, in 2003 Iraq War, because those conditions simply were not met, in my opinion.
The issue about Parliament agreeing, of course, is a fairly new one that's come about as a result of Iraq. Before that, we were happy to say that Parliament would meet after commencement in order to deal with it, whereas now, of course, we say to our enemies, hang on a second, we just need to get our MPs back, and we're going to talk about it for a day or two, and then we might take action. Elliot, on this issue about trust in the government, about Iraq, about conflict, what do you have to say?
I've got to say that the nation has been, their trust in the government and wars has just been dampened by the whole Iraq conflict. Definitely, people I've spoken to, just general consensus, especially with a lot of young people nowadays. You might hear a lot of people sometimes saying that a lot of young people, they war happy and happy to run into war. They're not. They deeply believe that the Iraq war wasn't perhaps the best thing for our country. And I think that's something which we need to go on to, is that a lot of people just don't think all these countries, Syria, Iraq, they're really far away from us. What have they actually got to do with us? That's a thing a lot of people are thinking. And in some way we need to maybe tell people why they may affect us, or just not get involved if they really do not affect us. We need to sort out our own issues first, quite frankly, before going into other countries. And I was going to say sort them out, but a lot of the time we just make them worse.
Gareth?
Yes, Matthew?
I'll just make 2 or 3 points.
Please do.
Thank you. On the issue that you raise of the fact that Parliament having a vote before conflict is a relatively new innovation, indeed it is, because of course previously, and still it can happen, is that the Prime Minister has something called the royal prerogative, which is as a Republican, and don't get me started off on all of that, we'll be here.
Please no.
We'll be here all night, Gareth. But it's true
we won't.
that the Prime Minister has the ability to literally, by his or her stroke of a pen, to send us to war without consulting Parliament at all. I think it is a good thing that Parliament tends to now be consulted on these issues. I hope that continues long into the future. So that's that point. I'm reminded of Robin Cook's speech on the eve of the debate about the Iraq invasion in 2003, which I thought was one of the best speeches I've ever heard given, when he said that it had neither international agreement nor domestic support. And I thought that was a very good line. It was entirely right. It didn't have a legal basis or backing from the UN, and the British public's mood was sound on that conflict. They didn't agree with it. Tony Blair and his government, and it has to be said the opposition, but not the Liberal Democrats, who I'm very proud on mass voted against that conflict. Well, they did, and I think they should get some praise for that. He disregarded both domestic public opinion and international opinion, and it was disgraceful, and I left Labour over it in 2003.
Thank you. Just to let you know what some people are saying and some of the points they're raising on this matter, John Mousley is telling us that there is no right answer in foreign policy. There are just less costly wrong ones. It's quite profound. Ryan Power is saying that all our Middle Eastern ventures have done is create power vacuums, civil disorder, internal conflicts, and weak governments. Perhaps certainly the one exception to that, and I think that's a very good point, is Tunisia. But what did we do differently there? Perhaps it's because we weren't that involved. John is also making the point, a small nation far away of which we know little. Sam Baxter, Iraq totally damaged our ability to do the right thing in the world. And on Twitter, this is also on Twitter, of course, Alex Ward is making the point. Hello again, Alex. I know you know a lot about foreign policy, but the prerogative to declare war was given up to Parliament by Gordon Brown, and no PM can do it without a vote now. I think that's certainly the convention, and I wonder, Alex, if you might be able to confirm whether there was any change in the actual law. But I think you're right, by convention, that is now the case, and it would be politically difficult for a Prime Minister to do much else. Anyone want to make a point on this at the moment? No. Okay. Well, let me.
I would mention. I would mention one quick point, Matthew. I completely agree with you on the monarchy. I think it's completely absurd that we have an unelected, unconsented monarchy.
Well,
That no one voted for.
Oh,
that
am
no
I
one
going
is
to have to mute you all here because
Nope.
this is a completely different topic.
So I agree with you, Matthew.
Different topic.
Don't you make me
I'm very
real
happy.
issues.
Yes, I'm very happy for us to have a debate on the monarchy on another occasion. I don't think it's something we should do unprompted tonight.
I shall look forward to that, Gareth.
I
Yes.
do too.
Yes, I'm sure many will, but not now. We already went off on one on Trident. Just a couple of points here. In fact, we're going to end that topic now, and then we're going to come to the last person who hasn't opened the subject, which is you, Matthew, being one of the online survivors, seeing as everyone else has had technical difficulties. This is a very important question. It will take you just a few moments to answer, though, but I do want to know. This is a question from Emery Alice at Illiberal Me. Have anyone on the panel ever dunked their McDonald's chicken nuggets into a strawberry milkshake? Lily,
No.
you have not. Elliot,
No.
Matthew,
No, I have not.
no. And I can confirm I neither have nor will I, as I never go
have.
to McDonald's anymore.
I've done it once.
You
It's
did.
good. Yeah, you should totally do it. It's really good.
I'm disturbed.
Honestly, it's really good. You should try things new.
I don't think I have anything to say to that. I'm just
Yeah. No comment.
just outrageous. No, I know I never will, because I hate McDonald's. It was my first job ever was at McDonald's, and after that I've managed to not go back in.
I think you're probably far too refined, Gareth, aren't you? Far too refined a character.
Well, all I'll say is I had a KFC today and a Domino's last night. So
Or maybe not, then.
you can decide how refined my eating habits are from that. Just a couple of final points that people have made before we move on, Matthew, for you to talk about anything else to do with the coalition that you want to, positive or negative. Here we are. Adam Hawkes is saying about the monarchy debate, please not tonight. He has many views on this, but he may have to leave us soon. We will be finishing.
I'm not going to mention it anymore tonight, I promise.
Yes, don't you dare.
You guys down. Sorry.
Yes. John is telling us that basically that's just communism. So might be with you on that one. Stuart Crow, who is at Stu Crow. Iraq and Afghanistan completely unbalanced our defence policy, and we will suffer for a long time to come. We've got. There is another question here, which I'll come to actually from Pixel Pusher in a few minutes' time, which is about the DFE tweet from earlier. We'll come back to that.
Actually, that might follow on from what I want to raise.
Certainly. So let's go now to Councillor Hulbert.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Yeah, I wanted to follow on from the equal marriage point because that was fantastic. You know, it means that I and many others now have full equality under the law, which is brilliant. But my concern is that some people think that means that the LGBT equality agenda is now over with and done with, and you've got your equality now, haven't you? Well, actually, I want to raise a number of points that where there's still work to do. One of them is the fact that a part of these isles still doesn't have equal marriage. That's Northern Ireland, and we mustn't forget that and still keep campaigning there. Local LGBT services are dreadfully underfunded, and I know that from personal experience here in Leicestershire. Trans rights is still a big issue, and homophobic bullying, although we have seen the wonderful announcement this week, I'd like to think Lib Dem inspired, of £2 million of new funding to try and help end homophobic bullying, whether in the workplace or indeed in schools. So the equality agenda still has a very long way to go. Equal marriage was fantastic, but there's still a long way to go towards equality.
Okay, Lily,
Yes.
do you want to say anything on this topic?
Well, I don't think we have equal marriage at the moment. It doesn't feel like equal marriage as a trans person. I mean, when you introduce same-sex marriage and then you include into it trans discriminatory provision, I mean, it's, for me in particular, it doesn't feel like equal marriage. And you're right about Northern Ireland. You're right about Northern Ireland in particular. I mean, we need to focus on Northern Ireland in particular because they seem like in a different world in regards to LGBT rights. I mean, so we need to focus on Northern Ireland. I agree with you in regards to youth services. Agree with you in regards to homophobic bullying. I think we also need to focus on transitioning. So, for example, like hormones and trans people want to transition. I really don't think that's good enough either. I think the NHS is a complete joke in regards to trans people wanting transition like me. I've got a complete history and example with that. But I agree with you completely, though, Matthew. You know, there's so much we need to do in regards to LGBT plus rights. the coalition has done some way towards that. For example, same-sex marriage, but it's not good enough at the moment, and we need to make a big push towards complete equality, which is a long way to go, in particular. So.
Is Gareth there?
I think it's
I
muted.
couldn't hear him. I couldn't hear Gareth.
I'm so sorry. I've got to mute it myself. That's something I'm not used to. Elliot,
I thought that was just
Elliot, is there anything you'd like to add on this topic?
I'm really not up to scratch on this topic. I don't know a lot about it, so I can't add anything useful, I don't feel.
Fair
Well,
enough.
I'll just
Ladies
make
and
a
gentlemen,
further point then.
certainly, I'll come to you, Matthew. Can I just say, ladies and gentlemen, that's the kind of thing I would like to hear from people on Question Time.
I agree.
Sometimes they blather on about something they've clearly not got a clue. Matthew.
Well, I just wanted to point out that, and I don't want to go on an anti-Stonewall rant because they do some very good work. They do some very good work on many issues. But going back to the local LGBT services, I think part of the reason why so many of them are so badly funded and have gone under is because people see Stonewall, they see their big glittery glamorous campaigns, they see all the celebrities backing their campaigns, and fantastic, but then they give to them who, with the greatest of respect to them, from what I know, have quite a lot of money in their coffers, and they don't give to small, local, struggling, frontline LGBT services. And for me, this is a massive issue that needs to be faced. And I made a point when I heard about this £2 million of new funding this week. I tweeted Joe Swinson straight away, our Equalities Minister, and said, I hope this doesn't go, I didn't actually name them, but I said, I hope this doesn't all go to one organisation. It needs to go across the country to many local groups.
Thank you very much. I think this is a good time for us to start to draw tonight's show to an end, because I think there's a danger with the four of us. People are going to get bored of seeing us, just the four of us tonight. But we've covered a good old amount there. Let me first of all say thank you, obviously, to the three of you and Alex, who joined us earlier on, and Edward, who was joining us but then had even more technical issues than poor Alex has had. If you at home would like to get involved and appear on here next week, just tweet us, get in touch. All you need is preferably a reliable internet connection. That would be welcome. And, of course, some form of sound. You might find something like this, whilst it looks ridiculous, is really helpful, or whatever's built in onto your computer. This is me doing my Princess Leia impression, because I'll never get my hair that long. So if you'd like to join in, please do get in touch. Whether you are a supporter of any of the main political parties, including the Greens, UKIP, the Liberals, Conservatives, Labour, or if you're not a supporter of any of those parties. The people that we've been desperately trying to get and haven't had much success with this week, we're looking for people from the Green Party, Plaid Cymru, and following on from the things that have been said tonight, people from Northern Ireland who are involved in politics over there. We'd like to spread this out to as many as possible. So tweet us, DM us, let us know you're interested, and if you can do next Sunday night from around about 7:45 to 8 for our private get-together beforehand, and you know that your internet connection is at least okay to FaceTime or Skype someone, we can do that, and we'd love to have you on. If anyone has any ideas about what else we can do, let us know. There may be a more sort of fun game showy type one of these happening on Thursday. That's an idea that's been raised, but we'll see. But beyond that, thank you very much indeed for watching. Thank you for your comments and your tweets. The last one that I want to raise here is from Alex, who of course joined us earlier on. And I'm sorry we didn't get to the issue about the DFE, but I'm sure we'll cover it again, who just wants to point out that he has also never dunked his chicken nuggets in strawberry milkshake, but his friend wants to throw, I know, but his friend did want to throw 20 chicken nuggets away in a bin before when they were drunk, and he's never been so angry.
Don't blame him. Don't blame him.
Yeah, if someone...
Have a see.
It really is. If someone did that to me in relation to cheesecake, I think I might actually kill them. So, thank you very much, Matthew, for coming on tonight.
Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you, Elliot, for coming on tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you, Lily, for seeing you again this week. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all at home. You lot don't go anywhere yet, but all of you, that's the end of our broadcast for tonight. Thank you for getting in touch. Do join in. We want to see you here, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.